The desert air of New Mexico is a deceptive thing. It is stark and unforgiving, but it is also silent, vast, and capable of holding secrets for an immeasurable time. The small town of Elephant Butte, nestled by the massive reservoir of the same name, should have been a place of sunshine, simple living, and quiet retirement. Instead, for decades, it harbored an evil so profound, so utterly mechanized and methodical, that its eventual uncovering would shake the foundations of law enforcement's understanding of human depravity. This is the story of David Parker Ray, a man who, in the tranquil solitude of the desert, built a monument to his own sadistic fantasies. The Toy Box. The man who would become known as the Toy Box Killer was born David Parker Ray on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico. His early life was characterized by a financial precarity that forced him and his younger sister, Peggy Pearl Ray, to live with their maternal grandparents, Russell and Dolly Parker, on a small ranch. This upbringing was not one of simple ranch serenity. His mother's parents were strict disciplinarians, providing an unyielding environment. Yet, the greater disruption came from the sporadic visits of his father, Cecil Leland Ray, a mechanic described as a violent alcoholic. It was his father who would supply the young David with material that would warp his developing mind. Magazines depicting sadomasochistic pornography. This was not a passing curiosity. It was an external confirmation and cultivation of dark impulses that were already beginning to stir within him. While attending Mountain Air High School, Ray experienced the kind of bullying and social isolation that often feeds into a developing pathological personality. He was reportedly teased by his peers, particularly for being unusually shy with girls. Though described as a handsome teenager, this social inadequacy, a perceived failure in a critical area of adolescent development, seemed to drive him further into isolation and, crucially, into self-medication as he began to abuse alcohol and other drugs. This turbulent, formative period was when Ray's true darkness began to manifest. The fantasies of raping, torturing, and murdering women took hold. By the age of 14, these fantasies were tangible enough to be captured on paper in the form of disturbing sadomasochistic drawings and pornographic pictures of bondage practices. His sister saw these horrifying documents, an event that led to their estrangement, marking one of the first human connections severed by his burgeoning pathology. Ray himself chillingly claimed that his criminal career began as an adolescent. In the terrifying audio tape, which would later become a cornerstone of the case, Ray would boast, "I've been raping bitches ever since I was old enough to jerk off and tie little girls' hands behind their back." This self-proclamation suggests a lifespan of escalating violence that began roughly in the mid-1950s. When he would have been a teenager, he even alleged to his first wife that he committed his first homicide around 1957, when he was 17 or 18 years old, claiming he kidnapped a woman, tied her to a tree, and then tortured and killed her. Authorities were never able to definitively verify this particular account, but the claim itself, that his murderous rage began in his late teens, speaks to the terrifying breadth and duration of his self-confessed pathology. The identity of this alleged first victim remains one of the deepest, most unsettling unknowns of the case. An unproven shadow cast over the late 1950s that suggests an early onset, highly organized capacity for lethal violence. Following high school, Ray enlisted and received an honorable discharge from the United States Army, where he worked as a general mechanic. This period of military service often seen as a place for discipline and structure, failed to suppress the darkness within him. Instead, upon leaving the service, he secured a seemingly mundane job that provided him with a quiet existence and the time needed to nurture his escalating desires. He worked as a maintenance man for the New Mexico Parks Department in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. This seemingly innocuous cover of a hardworking state mechanic would allow him to operate below the radar for decades. Ray's early adult life was a constant cycle of failed relationships and marital instability. He was divorced 4 times and was a father to at least 2 children, including a son and a daughter, Glenda Jean Ray. His inability to maintain stable relationships was arguably a direct consequence of his hidden life, requiring him to constantly move and reset, preventing anyone from getting close enough to discover the horrors he cultivated. His criminal activities began well before the toy box was built. Court records show a pattern of property theft and minor offenses in Arizona and New Mexico, often revolving around the tools and materials a mechanic might use, but occasionally involving more serious, though non-homicidal violence. These smaller crimes served as both a financial means and a testing ground for his manipulative and domineering techniques. The lack of any major sex crime convictions during this period suggests an incredible cunning, as Ray managed to keep his severe sadism entirely separated from his public persona, or perhaps that his early victims were simply never found or were too traumatized to report. His subsequent conviction in the 1980s for sexual abuse and kidnapping of a woman in California, details of which were later heavily suppressed by the media, provides a clearer, chilling preview of the methodology he would later perfect in New Mexico, focusing on control, degradation, and the use of restraints. The psychological landscape of David Parker Ray suggests a man who developed his entire sense of self around his criminal fantasies. The sadistic drawings at age 14, the self-proclaimed first murder at 17, and the consistent documentation of his desires all point to a condition known as sexual sadism disorder, combined with antisocial personality disorder. For Ray, the control, the fear, and the systematic torture were the primary drivers, making the sexual assault a tool of degradation rather than the ultimate goal. The fact that he was teased for being unusually shy with girls in school is a classic, though simplistic, psychological indicator of a person overcompensating for profound feelings of inadequacy by seeking absolute lethal dominance over the very group they feared or felt rejected by. His military service as a mechanic was likely where he honed the crucial skills of engineering and compartmentalization, the ability to acquire, assemble, and maintain complex mechanical systems, which he chillingly applied to his torture chamber. This early life shows not an individual who snapped, but a decades-long, meticulous, and calculated progression toward becoming one of the most organized and technologically advanced sexual predators in U.S. history. The seemingly tranquil decades David Parker Ray spent in the vicinity of Truth or Consequences, T.O.C., New Mexico, were anything but. Ray moved through his life with an unsettling invisibility, a mechanic by trade and a monster by nature. His primary residence and workshop was a double-wide trailer home situated on a secluded plot near Elephant Butte Lake, approximately 7 miles north of T.O.C. This was an ideal operational base, remote enough to prevent close scrutiny, yet close enough to the main routes of Interstate 25 and Highway 181 to easily intercept transient victims. Ray's professional life was a facade of respectability and technical competence. Working as a maintenance man for the New Mexico Parks Department offered him three distinct advantages crucial to his secret life: a steady, non-suspicious income to fund his elaborate construction, access to large government vehicles and equipment, which would normalize the presence of his cargo trailer, and an official identity that made him appear reliable and non-threatening to potential victims. Furthermore, a mechanic's trade instilled in him a highly organized mechanical mind, an invaluable asset when designing and building a sophisticated torture chamber. His personal life in the 1970s and 1980s was characterized by a revolving door of 4 divorces. Each successive marriage seems to have ended as his sadistic demands and violent tendencies began to breach the domestic facade, suggesting he was constantly pushing the boundaries of his fantasy life onto his partners. He would later meet Cindy Hendy, a 37-year-old woman working at a state park in TRC. Hendy was herself fleeing convictions for grand theft and drug charges in Washington state. Their initial bond was chillingly immediate, rooted not in traditional romance, but in a shared interest in violent sexual fantasies. Hendy would quickly transition from girlfriend to full-blown accomplice, assisting in abductions and participating in the sexual torture. This partnership marked a dangerous escalation in Ray's crime spree, giving him the logistical and emotional support necessary to expand the scope and duration of his attacks. The toy box itself was the physical manifestation of Ray's decades-long fantasies, a process of construction that may have spanned over a decade, quietly completed in the secluded environment of Elephant Butte. Ray is believed to have spent approximately $100,000 outfitting the semi-trailer, an astonishing sum for a state employee at the time. This expenditure likely involved years of saving, cash transactions for equipment, and possibly the revenue generated from his other, less sensational crimes. The construction was meticulous. The trailer was fully soundproofed, using industrial-grade materials to prevent any screams from escaping. A crucial step, given the proximity of other remote residences and the nature of his activities. The evolution of Ray's torture methodology during this period became disturbingly refined. He began practicing his techniques on women he believed would not be missed, often prostitutes, drifters, or young women with limited family support networks. His pattern of kidnapping about 4 or 5 women a year and holding them captive for 2 to 3 months indicates a sophisticated, organized approach. This was not a quick, impulsive act of rage, but a long-term possession and utilization of human beings for his elaborate games. A highly significant, though less discussed, feature of Ray's TRC life was the network of alleged accomplices. Beyond Hendy and his daughter, Glenda Jean Ray, investigators later theorized that Ray may have had other associates, including several women he was dating. This suggests Ray was constantly testing people in his life, looking for those susceptible to his immense manipulation, or those who already harbored latent violent tendencies. The involvement of others was a form of insurance. It normalized the environment for Ray and provided multiple layers of co-conspirators who could assist in abductions, dispose of evidence, or simply provide psychological cover. One specific individual, Dennis Roy Yancey, was later identified as a male accomplice, underscoring that Ray's network of corruption extended beyond his immediate family. and romantic partners. Yancey's involvement in a suspected murder further cemented the fact that Ray's crime spree was a collaborative effort of sadism, operating with devastating effectiveness for decades. The silence surrounding David Parker Ray in Truth or Consequences was not the silence of the desert. It was the chilling, enforced silence of a highly organized, private nightmare. The Toy Box trailer was not merely a location for David Parker Ray's crimes. It was the architectural realization of his sexual pathology, a highly specialized, customized facility designed explicitly for prolonged sexual torture and degradation. Its discovery was a pivotal moment in true crime history, revealing a level of premeditation and mechanical sadism few investigators had ever encountered. The trailer was a repurposed, soundproofed cargo trailer located immediately adjacent to Ray's double-wide mobile home in Elephant Butte. Ray spent an estimated $100,000 outfitting the interior, transforming a mundane cargo space into a hellish torture chamber. The first and most critical component was the soundproofing, which ensured that the screams of his victims were contained, shielding his activities from the arid, quiet New Mexico air. The interior of the toy box was an inventory of pain. It was stocked with a grotesque collection of instruments and contraptions. These included standard instruments of bondage and corporal punishment, whips, chains and straps, pulleys and clamps, surgical blades and saws. But the trailer's true horror lay in its custom-engineered devices, designed for maximum confinement and systematic, prolonged agony. Leg spreader bars used to immobilize and overextend the victim. An electric shock machine, sometimes homemade, explicitly designed to deliver electrical shocks to his captives. A gynecological, obstetric table at the center of the room, to which victims were strapped for prolonged assaults. A mirror mounted in the ceiling directly above the table. This detail was profoundly sinister, as Ray wanted his victims to see everything he was doing to them, viewing this forced visual awareness as an essential part of the psychological torture. Elaborate locks and pulleys were installed to prevent escape and to allow Ray to suspend his victims for different games. Custom-built confinement devices, including a fur-lined coffin and a makeshift pillory. The coffin, often speculated to be a feature designed for sensory deprivation or for forcing victims into a prolonged, claustrophobic state of submission, speaks to a theatrical, deeply controlling sadism. Wooden contraptions that bent victims over and immobilized them, sometimes to allow his male dog or other friends to assault them. Beyond the torture implements, the toy box also functioned as a twisted museum of his crimes and fantasies. The walls were adorned with detailed diagrams of female anatomy and instructions for handling a sex slave, a clear indication that Ray was operating from a detailed, written protocol. He also kept syringes and various sex toys. Most disturbingly, the chamber was rigged for video and audio documentation. A television monitor and video camera were strategically placed to record the attacks, allowing Ray to not only document but also relive his terrifying games. The camera was often focused squarely on the gynecological chair. This documentation was further supplemented by Ray's diary, which contained horrific details of the torture inflicted on each victim, but with the crucial, deliberate omission of where he buried their remains. The purpose of the audio tape, which served as a chilling advisory message for his new captives, was not just to terrify them, but to instantly shatter their will to resist by laying out the systematic, inescapable reality of their impending torment. The toy box was the ultimate expression of an organized lust killer, combining mechanical ingenuity with an utter lack of human compassion to create a private hell where fantasy and reality merged into a systematic, documented nightmare. The horrifying scope of David Parker Ray's operation was not solely the work of one man. It was a collaborative effort of evil, built upon the manipulation and complicity of others. Ray successfully created a circle of co-conspirators, chief among them his long-term partner Cindy Hendy and his own daughter, Glenda Jean Ray, known as Jessie. Cindy Hendy's role was arguably the most essential to Ray's ability to operate undetected for as long as he did. She met Ray in Truth or Consequences while fleeing convictions for grand theft and drug charges in Washington state, making her an ideal target for manipulation and a partner in crime. She was transient, morally compromised, and desperate to avoid law enforcement. Their relationship was not one of simple romance, but a transactional partnership founded on shared violent sexual fantasies. Hendy's responsibilities were wide-ranging, luring and abducting victims. Hendy assisted in bringing women to the remote compound, often using her presence to lower the guard of potential victims. Active participation in torture. Ray's chilling audio tape told victims they would be forced to sexually service Hendy as well, suggesting her active and necessary participation in the sexual degradation. Logistical support. Hendy was essential for cleaning, disposing of evidence, and driving Ray to various locations, acting as the operational front for his secret life. Crucial post-arrest information. After her arrest, Hendy became a key informant. In exchange for a lighter sentence, she provided the grim, albeit unverifiable, details of how Ray disposed of his victims, dismembering them and dumping them in Elephant Butte Lake or desert ravines. Glenda Jessie, Jean Ray, David's daughter, was a deeply tragic figure in the criminal proceedings. While her involvement was confirmed in kidnapping and conspiracy, her relationship with her father was a complex mess of familial loyalty, fear, and apparent attempts to stop him. Chillingly, Jessie had tried to warn the FBI about her father's criminal activities as early as 1986. An FBI agent later recalled her claims that Ray was abducting and torturing women and selling them to buyers in Mexico. However, lacking concrete evidence, the FBI was unable to proceed, an unheeded warning that remains a colossal shadow over the investigation. Jessie's later participation in the kidnapping of Jill Suzanne Troyer in 1995, whom she argued with before leaving with her father toward Elephant Butte, solidified her complicity, but also suggests the immense psychological control Ray held over his own child, a lifetime of manipulation that culminated in criminal partnership. Investigators believe the circle of complicity was wider still. Evidence pointed to the involvement of Dennis Roy Yancey and several of the women he was dating. This points to a chilling theory. Ray was constantly vetting new acquaintances, seeking out individuals with vulnerabilities or latent violent interests who could be drawn into his horrific lifestyle. Dennis Roy Yancey, described as a male accomplice, Yancey was implicated in the disappearance and suspected murder of Sylvia Marie Parker in 1997, allegedly strangling her under Ray's orders. Other female associates. The allegation that multiple women he dated assisted him suggests Ray was running a sophisticated system of recruitment and co-option, a network that helped him procure victims and maintain the long-term domestic cover required for his toy box operations. The complexity of Ray's network of accomplices, spanning family, romantic partners, and friends, reveals his extraordinary manipulative genius. He created a shared environment of secrecy and violence, ensuring that if one accomplice were ever caught, they had enough to lose and enough to reveal to be instantly controlled or compromised. The fact that the toy box killer was not a solitary monster, but rather the central figure in a small, self-contained cult of sadism, is perhaps the most terrifying revelation of the entire case. David Parker, Ray's criminal career spanned over 4 decades, with his victims being targeted through highly methodical, consistent, and psychologically manipulative means. His victims were typically prostitutes or young, vulnerable females, often selected near major travel corridors, such as Interstate 25 or other routes, popular with drifters and transient individuals. Ray's methods relied on a convincing facade and the opportunistic exploitation of a woman's immediate need, a ride, help with a car, or a false job offer. The audio tape found in the toy box explicitly detailed Ray's methodology of psychological and physical control. This orientation message was designed to instantly strip the victim of any hope of escape or resistance. By outlining the systematic, long-term nature of the torture they were about to endure, he would typically 1. Kidnap and transport, abduct the victim, often with the aid of an accomplice like Cindy Hendy, ensuring the victim was quickly subdued and transported to the soundproofed trailer. 2. The orientation forced the victim to listen to his recorded advisory, detailing the inevitable sequence of beatings, rape, shock, mutilation, torture, humiliation, bloodshed, and eventually death. 3. Prolonged captivity. Hold the victim for an extended period, often 2 to 3 months, cycling them through the various instruments and confinements within the toy box. 4. Amnesia and disposal. For those he chose to release, a rare occurrence, he would severely drug them with barbiturates in an attempt to induce amnesia, then abandon them on a remote roadside, gambling that the psychological trauma and drug effects would erase the memory of his identity and the location. The most chilling aspect of Ray's terror campaign is the sheer number of unconfirmed victims. Authorities and accomplices believe Ray may have murdered up to 60 individuals throughout his life, though no bodies have ever been definitively located to confirm a single homicide conviction. Ray's own claims put his victim count at around 40 from several states. The chronological list of known and strongly suspected victims paints a grim picture of a decades-long career of sadism. The unidentified 1957 victim, alleged first homicide. Ray claimed to his first wife that he committed his first murder in 1957, kidnapping a woman, tying her to a tree, and then tortured and killing her. This anonymous victim represents the dark beginning of Ray's lifelong pathology, a crime that went utterly uninvestigated at the time. Billy Ray Bowers, suspected 1988 victim. Bowers, a co-owner of a used car business in Phoenix, Arizona, where Ray worked as a mechanic, disappeared in 1988. A year later, the body of an unidentified man, shot in the back of the head and wrapped in a blue tarp, was found in Elephant Butte Lake. Although identified as Bowers in 1999, Ray was never charged with the murder. Cindy Hendy later confirmed Ray confessed to her that he killed Bowers and dumped his body. Jill Suzanne Troyer, suspected 1995 victim. A 22-year-old woman last seen in Albuquerque in late September 1995. She was last seen arguing with Glenda Jean Jessie Ray before Jessie left with her father, David. towards the Elephant Butte Reservoir. Ray's diary contained detailed accounts of sexual torture and burials, matching Troya's description, but her body has never been found. Sylvia Marie Parker, suspected 1997 victim. A 22-year-old acquaintance of Ray's daughter and a homeless mother of two, Parker disappeared in July 1997. Accomplice Dennis Yancey later confessed that Parker was tortured for days and that he, under Ray's orders, strangled her to death. Yancey cooperated, taking police to the disposal site, but Ray is believed to have moved the remains to maintain his ultimate control over the mystery. The terror campaign was defined by Ray's mastery of compartmentalization. He was an organized lust killer who carefully managed his time and resources, keeping his atrocities entirely separate from his respectable job and community life. The lack of bodies, which prevented murder charges, was the ultimate result of this meticulous organization. The FBI's 2011 release of hundreds of images of artifacts, jewelry, clothing, and personal effects was a plea to the public to help re-establish the identities of the missing, hoping that a piece of forgotten evidence could finally give a name to a lost soul. The decades-long reign of David Parker Ray came crashing to an end, not through a police stakeout or an informant's detailed confession, but through the sheer will and heroic desperation of a single victim, Cynthia Vigil. Her survival was the pinprick of light that finally burst the dense, soundproofed darkness of the toy box. The chain of events began with Vigil's abduction and transport to Ray's Elephant Butte compound on March 19, 1999. For 3 horrific days, she was subjected to the full, premeditated terror Ray had prepared. She was one of the few individuals who experienced the full reality of the toy box, hearing the chilling audio tape, strapped to the gynecological table, and confronting the vast arsenal of torture instruments. Ray's typical pattern involved prolonged captivity, forcing his victims into psychological servitude. Had Vigil not escaped when she did, she would likely have suffered the same fate as the dozens of others who vanished. The escape itself was a confluence of opportunity, desperation, and unbelievable courage. On the 3rd night of her captivity, Vigil found a moment, a fleeting lapse in Ray's and Hendy's perpetual vigilance, and seized it. Despite being chained, bound, and severely traumatized, Vigil somehow managed to slip her restraints, flee the confines of the trailer, and run desperately into the New Mexico desert. Barely clothed, injured, and in a state of terror, her flight was a desperate, primal act of self-preservation. She ran toward the distant lights of a nearby mobile home complex, a beacon of safety in the vast, unforgiving darkness. Tragically, the first motorist she flagged down reportedly swerved to avoid her and sped off, perhaps assuming she was a drunken transient or a hallucination in the desolate night. This rejection did not deter her. Her life depended on reaching safety. She finally reached a mobile home where the door was open, and the residents immediately called the police. Cynthia Vigil's survival and her subsequent harrowing account were the first irrefutable surviving testimonies of the systematic evil operating in Elephant Butte. Her detailed description of the elaborate torture chamber, the specific instruments used, and the methodology of the assailants gave the police enough concrete evidence to obtain an immediate search warrant and descend upon the property. This was the crucial breakthrough that had eluded law enforcement for decades. Ray's intricate structure of control, built on amnesia and the absence of bodies, was rendered moot by the simple, powerful act of a single woman's escape. The immediate police response found Cynthia Vigil's clothes inside David Parker Ray's main double-wide trailer, confirming her story and the struggle. Officers quickly secured the property, arresting Ray and Cindy Hendy shortly thereafter. The discovery of the cargo trailer, the toy box, and its contents immediately escalated the investigation from a local kidnapping to a federal case involving a suspected mass murderer. Cynthia Vigil's heroic defiance did not just save her life, it potentially saved dozens of future victims and finally brought the shadow of the toy box killer into the unforgiving light of day. The arrest of David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy on the night of March 23, 1999, marked the end of the line for the toy box killer. The initial search of the property immediately confirmed the unspeakable nature of Vigil's claims, forcing investigators to confront a crime scene that defied all previous experience. The police secured the double-wide trailer, finding immediate evidence of Vigil's captivity, including her clothing, as well as several medical and torture devices scattered throughout, like a homemade electric shock device. However, the true terror was contained within the soundproofed cargo trailer outside. The systematic inventory of the toy box revealed the horrifying extent of Ray's depravity and his meticulous planning. The physical evidence included the obstetrical, gynecological table, the central focus of the room, designed for maximum immobilization and violation, restraints and suspensions, whips, chains, pulleys, clamps, and custom leg spreader bars, confinement devices, the fur-lined coffin and makeshift pillory, symbols of sensory deprivation and absolute control, surgical and mutilation tools, surgical blades, saws, and large customized instruments for violation. The discovery of the audio and visual evidence was perhaps the most crucial element in proving Ray's state of mind and systematic intent. Found within the trailer was the infamous audio tape, a chilling orientation message recorded by Ray himself on July 23, 1993. In a calm, methodical voice, Ray detailed the exact sequence of torture and eventual death awaiting his captives. This recording served multiple functions. It was a tool of psychological torture for the victim. It was an explicit confession of his intent. And it was the unflinching proof of his premeditation, turning him from a simple rapist into an organized serial torturer. The presence of video cameras and a diary, meticulously detailing the torture of each victim, but deliberately omitting any burial sites, revealed a man obsessed with documentation and control, even from beyond the grave. The immediate investigation quickly escalated to the federal level with the involvement of the FBI Albuquerque field office, revealed the vast discrepancy between the number of torture claims and the lack of physical remains. This led to a massive, ongoing effort to find bodies, focusing on the Elephant Butte Lake and surrounding ravines. Based on Ray's claims and the scale of the toy box, investigators estimated his true victim count could be up to 60. The public search for victims gained massive attention when the FBI released hundreds of images of artifacts collected from the compound in 2011. These items, jewelry, clothing, belts, wallets, and personal trinkets, were believed to have been taken as trophies from his victims. The hope was that family or friends of missing women would recognize an item, giving a name to a possible victim and a location to search. This plea, years after Ray's death, underscored the unique, terrifying nature of the case. A killer whose victims were confirmed by the instruments and documentation left behind, but whose final resting places were an enigma sealed by his meticulous planning. The Pandora's box was opened, but the final devastating secrets, the names and locations of his lost souls, remain locked within the vastness of the New Mexico desert. The legal proceedings that followed David Parker Ray's arrest were a complex, agonizing, and ultimately incomplete pursuit of justice. Because no bodies were ever conclusively linked to Ray, prosecutors faced the challenge of proving murder without a corpus delicti for the majority of his alleged victims. This critical hurdle forced the prosecution to focus on the provable crimes of kidnapping, sexual assault, and torture. David Parker Ray was convicted in 2001 in connection with the kidnapping and torture of 2 women, including the brave survivor, Cynthia Vigil. The central pieces of evidence were the victim's testimony, the highly detailed contents of the toy box, and Ray's own audio tape, which served as an unequivocal statement of his criminal intent. The trial painted a picture of calculated, mechanized sadism that horrified the nation. Conviction. Ray was found guilty of kidnapping and other charges. Sentence. The judge handed down an enormous sentence of 224 years imprisonment. This effectively ensured that Ray would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, a necessary but inadequate consequence for a suspected mass murderer. Ray did not serve his full sentence. On May 28, 2002, at the age of 62, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack while incarcerated at Lea County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico. His death occurred shortly before a final critical interrogation planned by police, which was intended to press him on the locations of his victims' remains. Ray took the secrets of his lost victims to the grave, an act of final, deliberate cruelty that cemented his control over the narrative of his crimes. Ray's accomplices also faced their own legal reckoning, their trials providing crucial, horrifying context for the operation of the toy box. Cindy Hendy, partner, active participant in abductions, luring victims, and torture, logistical support and disposal assistance, convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy, received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony and cooperation regarding the disposal of victims. Glenda Jean Ray, daughter, active participant in at least one abduction, Jill Suzanne Troyer, and conspiracy, convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy. Her testimony provided key insight into her father's methods and mindset. Dennis Roy Yancey, male associate, alleged participant in the torture and strangulation of Sylvia Marie Parker in 1997, cooperated with police, leading them to an alleged disposal site, though the body was later found to have been moved by Ray. Faced charges related to his involvement. The conviction of the accomplices was an essential step in dismantling Ray's operation, but it did not satisfy the full measure of justice sought by the victims' families. The judicial process confirmed the existence of a horrific, systematic criminal enterprise. Yet, the ultimate question, how many died and where are they now, remained unanswered. A stark failure that continues to haunt the New Mexico landscape. The death of David Parker Ray, the primary defendant, halted all legal proceedings related to the unconfirmed murders, leaving the suspected murder victims forever in a state of legal limbo. The death of David Parker Ray in 2002 did not close the case. It merely cemented the mystery. With Ray silenced, the location of his 40 to 60 suspected victims became a secret buried with him, a heartbreaking reality for dozens of families across several states. The search for justice shifted from prosecution to a desperate, ongoing effort to find closure through the recovery of remains. The belief that Ray's victims were primarily dumped in the vicinity of his Elephant Butte property drove a massive coordinated search effort involving the FBI Albuquerque field office, the New Mexico State Police, and specialized search teams. Elephant Butte Lake, the vast reservoir with its complex shoreline and deep waters, was the primary focus, based on Cindy Hendy's claims that Ray had dismembered the bodies and dumped them into the lake or nearby ravines. Despite the use of sonar, cadaver dogs, and extensive ground searches, the immense geographical area and the suspected dismemberment made a conclusive discovery impossible. The one body that was eventually identified as Billy Ray Bowers was found in the area. But the circumstances of its discovery, shot in the head and wrapped in a tarp, do not entirely align with the dismemberment claims for the majority of the victims. The desert ravines. The remote, arid landscape is itself a grave, making ground penetration difficult and scattering remains over time. The search for Sylvia Marie Parker proved this point. Accomplice Dennis Yancey took police to the original disposal site, but Ray had already moved her remains, proving his post-crime planning extended to constantly maintaining control over the final truth. In a unique and unprecedented move in 2011, the FBI launched the Items and Artifacts in David Parker Ray Case project. This was a direct public appeal to solve the cold case puzzle piece by piece. The FBI released hundreds of images of items collected from Ray's property, including jewelry, rings, necklaces, and other personal adornments, clothing and accessories, belts, purses, and articles of clothing, personal trinkets, small, intimate items believed to have been taken as trophies from the victims. The goal was to have the family or friends of missing persons recognize these items, which would then allow the FBI to cross-reference the recognized item with the specific context of its recovery at Ray's property. This was a strategy born of desperation, attempting to use the killer's trophies as the key to unlock the victims' identities. The effort, while raising significant public awareness, ultimately yielded few definitive, actionable leads that led to body recovery. The unrecovered bodies represent the greatest ongoing failure of the case. Ray's conscious choice to omit burial locations from his diary, combined with his dismemberment and deep water disposal methods, ensured that the proof of his most severe crimes remained hidden. Without the bodies, the families of women like Jill Suzanne Troyer and Sylvia Marie Parker are left with strong suspicion, but no definitive proof or place to mourn. The shadow of the toy box killer continues to loom over the Southwest, a testament to the chilling power of a highly organized serial killer to erase his victims from the face of the earth and forever frustrate the pursuit of justice. David Parker Ray's psychological profile is the portrait of a pure, methodical sadist. The crimes were not the result of a single break with reality, but the decades-long, meticulous execution of a deep-seated pathology. He was an organized lust killer who exhibited classic traits of antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, defined by a profound lack of empathy, an inability to feel guilt, and a total disregard for the rights and suffering of others. For Ray, the primary motive was absolute control and the psychological degradation of his victims, with sexual violence being merely the most extreme tool for achieving this dominance. This is evident in the meticulous design. The $100,000 toy box was an engineering feat of sadism. The use of mechanics and custom restraints reflects his need to fully reduce the victim to an object, a machine to be operated and maintained solely for his pleasure. Forced witnessing. The ceiling mirror above the gynecological table, a detail he explicitly wanted his victims to see, was an act of supreme psychological cruelty, forcing the victim to be a passive witness to their own violation, thereby maximizing their humiliation and internal trauma. The audio tape and diary. His documentation habits, the audio tape, video cameras, and diary reveal an obsession with reliving and preserving his crimes. This is a common trait among organized sadists who use documentation as a form of trophy collection and to satisfy a need for validation of their own terrifying power. The alleged victim count of up to 60 remains one of the most horrifying and statistically difficult aspects of the case. While only 2 women were successfully prosecuted, the circumstantial and testimonial evidence strongly suggests a far greater number. Ray's claim. Ray himself claimed to have abducted about 40 victims from several states. The FBI's suspicion, the FBI's long-term involvement, and the scope of the evidence led them to suspect a number closer to the higher end. The abduction rate, the calculated rate of 4 to 5 victims per year over the span of his 42-year criminal career, 1957-1999, mathematically supports a victim count far exceeding the confirmed few. Even a modest average of 3 victims per year over 42 years yields 1 to 26, making the 60 victim estimate a relatively conservative figure for such an organized and long-active predator. The prevailing theory is that the actual number of victims is likely closer to his self-claimed 40, potentially stretching across the southwest states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. His method of targeting vulnerable, transient women, combined with his drug-induced amnesia technique for survivors, ensured that a high percentage of his crimes would never be reported, maintaining the chilling silence around his existence for decades. The story of the toy box killer received massive media coverage, focusing primarily on the horrific details of the toy box itself. The case is often cited as a benchmark for extreme, premeditated sadism. The public release of the audio tape transcript and the image of the toy box solidified his legacy as a figure of unimaginable evil. The media's focus on Cynthia Vigil's bravery also provided a crucial counter-narrative, turning the survivor into a symbol of resilience against overwhelming terror. The sheer mechanical novelty and horrifying sophistication of the toy box established a dark blueprint for extreme organized sadism. While David Parker Ray's operation was unique, the concept of a dedicated, custom-built space for confinement and torture, a kill room or torture chamber, is a terrifying motif found in several other high-profile serial killer cases, leading to theories of influence or shared psychological archetypes. The common thread among torture chamber killers is the overwhelming need for absolute controlled power and the ability to operate undetected for long periods. Ray's use of a trailer for mobility and soundproofing was his innovation, but the core psychological need for a designated, soundproofed kill space is shared by other infamous sadists. Dean Call, the Candyman. Call, who was born the same year as Ray, operated out of his Pasadena, Texas home, using various locations for his systematic capture, abuse, and murder of young men and boys. While his setup was less mechanized than Ray's, the element of prolonged, controlled captivity and the use of accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., to lure victims parallels Ray's methodology. Cole's operation was a localized, highly organized system of abuse, relying on the same principles of social camouflage and collaborative secrecy as Ray's. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the Toolbox Killers. The name itself draws a thematic connection to Ray's toy box. Bittaker and Norris abducted, raped, and tortured 5 teenage girls in Southern California in 1979. Their operation relied on a customized van, which they called the Murder Machine, equipped with tools, audio equipment, and instruments of torture, allowing them to operate on the move. While not a stationary structure, the mechanized use of tools and the recording of their victims' suffering, a key element in Ray's toy box, links them psychologically to Ray's need for documentation and industrial-scale torture. The question of whether David Parker Ray inspired direct copycats is difficult to prove definitively, as any criminal inspired by him would likely take extraordinary care to hide their methods, much as Ray did for decades. However, the media saturation of the toy box case means its methods enter the dark catalogue of crime for other developing sadists. The New Mexico region, particularly the highways around Truth or Consequences, remains an area of ongoing investigation for connections to other disappearances. The theory of Ray's connections to other unsolved disappearances in Arizona and New Mexico is strong, suggesting that the copycats may simply have been Ray's unconfirmed accomplices who continued to operate, or former associates who adopted his methods. The potential involvement of multiple women he dated also suggests a legacy of individuals who learned and were desensitized to his methodology, perhaps continuing their own smaller-scale versions of the crimes after his death. In essence, while no one has been arrested and explicitly called a toy box copycat, Ray established the archetypal mechanized monster, a meticulously organized sadist who created a specialized, industrial-scale environment of pain. His most enduring legacy is the terrifying realization that such a hidden, highly financed, and collaborative terror operation can function perfectly for decades beneath the mask of normal community life, making the vast, quiet New Mexico desert a permanent, unsolved graveyard. The geographical reach of David Parker Ray's alleged crimes extended far beyond the confines of his Elephant Butte trailer. Ray was an organized predator who traveled and operated across multiple state lines, focusing his abductions on vulnerable individuals in the Southwest, particularly those who were transient or had limited support networks. The theory is that Ray's victims were abducted from New Mexico, Arizona, and possibly Texas, making the overall victim list incredibly difficult to compile. The majority of the intense investigation focused on unsolved disappearances and missing persons cases in New Mexico, particularly those clustered around the Interstate 25 corridor, which runs near Truth or Consequences. Ray's established method was to lure victims from bars, truck stops, or by feigning car trouble along major highways. The disappearance of several women in the 1980s and 1990s in the state remains potentially linked. Jill Suzanne Troyer, 1995, last seen in Albuquerque, a major city on I-25. Her argument with Jesse Ray and subsequent departure with David Parker Ray toward Elephant Butte makes her one of the most strongly suspected victims, despite the absence of a body. Sylvia Marie Parker, 1997, disappeared in New Mexico, confirming Ray's ability to target within his own immediate social sphere. The vast arid landscape itself is a compounding factor. New Mexico has numerous remote, unpatrolled roads, canyons, and ravines that serve as ideal dumping grounds, which is why the Elephant Butte Lake region remains the primary focus. Ray's ability to operate across several states stems from his mechanic's trade and his use of a semi-trailer for the toy box. His job often required him to travel for parts or equipment, and the nature of the trailer meant he could transport his operation, or at least his large tools, without arousing suspicion. The FBI's release of artifacts in 2011 was specifically aimed at a nationwide audience, recognizing that the belongings of the missing could have originated anywhere from the West Coast to the Midwest. The ultimate tragedy of his interstate reach is that local police departments across the Southwest may have unknowingly been searching for victims who had already been transported hundreds of miles to the toy box in New Mexico, creating a geographical and jurisdictional nightmare that allowed Ray's crimes to remain undiscovered for so long. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the David Parker Ray case is the realization that law enforcement had an opportunity to stop him 13 years before Cynthia Vigil's heroic escape. This failure stems from the unheeded warnings provided by his own daughter, Glenda Jean Jessie Ray, and the limitations of investigative technology at the time. In 1986, Jessie Ray, in what appears to have been a desperate attempt to stop her father, contacted the FBI. An FBI agent later recalled the core of her allegations. Jessie claimed that her father, David Parker Ray, was abducting and torturing women and selling them to buyers in Mexico. Failure to act. At the time, the claims were deemed too vague and unsubstantiated to warrant a full-scale investigation or an arrest. The sheer horror and complexity of the allegation, torture, abduction, and international trafficking likely made the claims seem incredible or even delusional without any physical evidence or confirmed victims. The consequence, the failure to act on this tip, allowed David Parker Ray to continue his operation for another 13 years, during which he likely claimed at least 40 to 65 victims, according to his established rate of 4 to 5 per year. This lapse allowed him to build the sophisticated toy box and draw in more accomplices, including Dennis Yancey and others. Another investigative failure was the reliance on antiquated and unreliable forensic methods in other interactions with Ray. While Ray was a highly organized individual, it is possible he was questioned in relation to the disappearances of the other women. The psychological profile of an antisocial personality, psychopath, like Ray, is that they possess an ability to lie without the physiological signs of stress that polygraphs are designed to detect. A skilled psychopath can often pass a polygraph test, making the test not only useless, but actively detrimental to an investigation by falsely eliminating a prime suspect. Ray's criminal sophistication was such that he likely navigated early police inquiries with ease, maintaining his social camouflage as a humble state mechanic. The unheeded warning of 1986 serves as a painful illustration of the difficulties in prosecuting organized sadists who operate within tight, hidden networks. Without a body, a victim, or a dedicated, state-of-the-art task force, the claims of a single, arguably compromised informant were simply not enough to breach the fortress of the toy box and the mind of the toy box killer. David Parker Ray's death in 2002 brought a premature end to his sentence, but not to the case. He died 6 years before the national implementation of genetic genealogy in cold cases, and decades before the latest advances in deep-water sonar technology. Had he lived, modern forensic science might have provided the final, definitive evidence needed for murder convictions potentially revealing the locations of his victims in exchange for a plea or reduced charges for his accomplices. The enduring legacy of the Toy Box Killer is one of unanswered questions and profound grief. The victims. Up to 60 souls remain lost, their identities only hinted at by the trophies in Ray's possession. The FBI's efforts to match these artifacts continue. A quiet, desperate search for closure that may never be fully realized. The accomplices, Cindy Hendy and Glenda Jean Ray, eventually served their time for kidnapping and conspiracy. Their cooperation provided key insight into the monster they helped, but their information was ultimately incomplete or purposefully vague on the exact disposal locations. The survivor, Cynthia Vigil, the heroic survivor whose bravery shattered Ray's empire, stands as the most vital testimony to the horrors that transpired. Her willingness to speak out provided the only true light in this decades-long darkness. The case of David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer, remains an active, albeit dormant file. The New Mexico desert continues to hold its secrets, a silent, vast graveyard waiting to give up the final, devastating truth about the man who built a hell on earth. If you appreciate the in-depth, atmospheric dive into complex and chilling true crime cases like this, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, remember to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill History, for unsolved mysteries and historical content, respectively. The chilling details of David Parker Ray's case, including the extensive documentation of his methods, are explored in this video. David Parker Ray, the sadistic toy box killer that preyed on women. https://www.youtube.com.watch. VM9RI WTMWLOE